in the early 2000s, a Japanese film director by the name of Takashi Shimizu released an acclaimed horror film called The Grudge. Now, you might not be a fan of early 21st century Japanese horror, but the movie surprisingly relates well to our scriptures today. The movie, of course, is filled with jump scares and all the things that we associate with that genre. It tells the story of a horrific crime that is rooted in anger and hatred. And of course, that evolves into this supernatural, all-consuming evil that lashes out in the world and hurts many people. And of course, this idea is not unique to the Japanese literary tradition. We see the effects of grudges and anger and hatred in some of our most iconic stories. We, of course, have the story of Sweeney Todd and the ninth grade obligatory story of Romeo and Juliet, and how a grudge and anger and violence sort of led to tragedy in the lives of those characters. Now, last week, Father preached about the different types of anger that we find in Scripture. And that is to say that we oftentimes find righteous anger, which aims to right injustice in the world and is most associated with God. But then, of course, there is the anger that you and I are most aware of in the world, and that, of course, is the anger that a person feels towards another in the hopes of destroying them in some way, harming them or harming a loved one. He also reminded us, I think, most importantly, of the antidote to that kind of anger, which is kindness. He talked about how, when faced with evil, Jesus always responded with kindness. Now, this week, I would like to focus today on the power that God gives us to forgive. That is to say, that God gives to you and to me the faith to forgive and the faith to love selflessly. In many ways, when we think about what causes anger in the world, what moves us to hold grudges against one another, is a hurt that we've experienced in life. And that hurt can come from many different places. It could be a parent, it could come from a brother or a sister, a boyfriend or girlfriend, a spouse or a former spouse. It might be that a boss has inflicted some hurt upon us, or a colleague at work, a friend, or at least someone we thought was our friend. It might even be something so unusual that the only answer that forms in our mind is that maybe God caused this pain. Even though we know it's not true, we sometimes maybe blame God for some of the hurt that we experience in life, why he wasn't there. Whatever it is that was said or did, whatever a person did or did not do, it hurt us. And that hurt can remain for a very long time. We can carry that pain with us throughout our whole lives. And like the movie Grudge, in some cases it can lead us to become stuck in this sort of negative mindset of anger and hatred as it sort of just is with us like a heavy burden upon our shoulders. And of course, God knows this, doesn't he? That's why in the reading from the book of Leviticus, he says to Moses, "You shall not bear hatred for your brother or your sister in your heart. Though you may reprove your fellow citizen, do not incur sin because of him." Now, I've always found pretty fascinating what God does not say in this passage. He's not saying that you and I don't have the right to our feelings. He's not telling us that we don't have the right to feel the hurt, because we do have a right to those feelings based on that experience. But what he is telling us is not to allow those feelings to separate us from one another, not to allow those feelings of anger to consume us, because that kind of anger can lead us to destroy all relationships in life that are good. Our relationship with ourselves, Sometimes we blame ourselves for the hurt in life, with others, and maybe even our relationship with God. That is where the power of faith comes in. That is why it is such an important gift that he gives to us. When we can tap into that power of faith, the faith to forgive ourselves, to forgive others, if possible. And I'm not always sure that it is true, that it is possible. Or to forgive even God. When we tap into that power, we're able to relieve ourselves of that heavy burden we carry. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, we hear the last of the 6 teachings that begin with, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." Last week, Father examined the first, and there's a lot to unpack in all of these sayings. You have heard it said, but I say to you. And so let's take a look at what Jesus tells us in Matthew's Gospel. Jesus says this, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." Now, in the Greek world, there were 3 words that described love. And they were this. One was the Greek word eros, which we most associate with romantic love. And Jesus is not talking about eros when he speaks about loving our enemy. There was the second form of love that the Greeks discussed, and that was philios, the love that we have for friends, our brothers and sisters. And of course, in America, we have the wonderful city of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, named in honor of that very tradition. But Jesus, he's not talking about that type of love either. Then there was this third type of love, and it wasn't used very much in the ancient world. And it really is a word that is most associated with Christ and his life. And that word was agape. That is to say, a love that is self-emptying, that desires the good for all people, whether they themselves deserve it or not. A type of self-emptying love. And that is the love that Jesus is talking about in this passage when he tells us to love our enemies. To be like him. If there was ever a word that really captured who Jesus was, it would be this word agape. Self-emptying love. And of course, when we can tap into that love, we find ourselves free from all of the burdens of life. And that power of anger and grudges and hatred can be lifted from us. And we can love ourselves and love others in the way that Jesus loved. The power to forgive and the power to love. And that's really what Jesus is talking about in this passage. Now let's face it, in life, we experience a lot of hurts. And those hurts are real, and the feelings that they leave behind are real. But Jesus offers us this opportunity, an invitation of sorts, to tap into that power of faith, the faith to forgive, if we can, and the power to love selflessly. And of course, when we remember that God gives us these gifts, it makes it a little bit easier to perhaps put them into practice.